in the book of Genesis. So we're looking at Genesis chapter 40 today specifically, but of course, you know that we will have skipped a few chapters. We've skipped chapter 38, and we're going to be skipping the majority of chapter 39. Though those events ought to be in our mind, but we're going to, for the sake of time, we're going to start from Genesis chapter 29, Genesis chapter 39, verse 20, and continue on till the end of Genesis chapter 40. So verse 20, and Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he remained there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison, and whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. Chapter 40. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker offended their lord, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. He put them into custody in the house of the captain of the guard and in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he waited on them, and they continued for some time in custody. One night, they both dreamed. The cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own meaning. When Joseph came to them in the morning, and he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" And they said to him, "We have had dreams. There is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms came out, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days, and within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But remember me when it is well with you. Please do me the kindness to make mention of me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this place. For in fact, I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that should have put me into the dungeon." When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, "I have had a dream also, and there were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket were all the sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating out of the basket on my head." Joseph answered, "This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a pole, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all of his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his cupbearing, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But the chief baker he hanged, just as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." So we have bypassed Genesis chapter 38. Genesis chapter 38 has some adult themes in it, and so that's one of the reasons why we haven't covered it here. But I do want to make a couple of mentions to it before we get into it. Genesis chapter 38, when you read it, it's a it seems like a strange insertion into the storyline of Joseph, because we started with the storyline of Joseph. He's the loved one, the most loved of Jacob, and then he gets sold. And right after that, we then stop that story and we shift over to Judah. Judah's the eldest. Judah was supposed to be the one to whom the inheritance, the majority of the inheritance belongs to. And you would assume that he would be the great character within the family of Jacob, but he's not. And that's exactly what Genesis 38 is intentionally trying to show us, that this is not a great family. And the next in line is certainly no better. It shows us the depths to which Jacob's family would sink. And in one sense, if you're recording the history of your nation, this would be the story that you would want to leave out, because it's really awkward, it's quite embarrassing, and it's just in no way beneficial for projecting yourselves as a dignified people. And we're not going to get into the different theories for why some people believe this chapter was inserted here, but I'll point out one thing that gives us some sense of significance to that chapter. The chapter ends with the birth of Perez and Zerah, two children that were born to the relationship between Judah and Judah's daughter-in-law. This is a strange action, and these two kids aren't really spoken of much more in the Old Testament, but they do show up in the New Testament. In fact, they show up in the genealogy of Jesus. And so out of nowhere, from a storyline that seems to be just really dark, we're reminded that God is still at work and that God is still up to something. So while this storyline seems to be going downwards, there's another storyline that God has and he's working on, and that's the storyline of Joseph. Joseph, by the way, doesn't become part of the genealogy of Jesus. Lots of reasons for theological reasons and practical reasons for why we can point out why that is, but we're not going to get too far into it. We're just pointing out that there seems to be two storylines going on here. One storyline shows how God works even through the mistakes of his people. The other storyline shows how God works through the obedience of his people. And the common point between both of these stories is that God works, but of course you would prefer to be on the side of Joseph, except the side of Joseph isn't all that pleasant either. Because now in Genesis chapter 39, though it seems like he's going to get elevated, within a matter of a few moments, his entire reputation gets shot down by Potiphar's wife, and he's thrown into prison. In the earlier stories of the patriarchs, in all of their mistakes and in all of the consequences, we know that it's because of their mistakes. And in spite of all of these things, we're reminded of God's faithfulness because of his covenant to them. Here it's the opposite. Joseph didn't do anything wrong. And what's on full display in the Joseph stories is actually Joseph's faithfulness to God, to trust God in spite of the negative situation that's happening around him that might lead some people to reject God. It only caused him to cling on to God even further. Again, it's important that we keep this in the context, right? Joseph was given a dream that great things would happen to him, and yet his brothers hated him. They sold him. He ends up as a slave. But he rises up and he becomes the chief servant in the household of Potiphar, and then he's thrown into prison. Joseph is a perfect case study for a person to whom God reveals his plans, but then he doesn't get to see them happen. How do you react in that sort of situation when you're told by God the end result, but you don't get to see it just yet. And oftentimes you see the opposite of it happening. Genesis chapter 40 starts with the phrase, after some time. It's a phrase that shows up many times earlier in Genesis, and it'll show up again a couple more times in the book of Genesis. And each time it refers to a significant duration of time. There's a great deal of time that has passed while he is in the jail. Somehow, while he's in jail, though, he's able to work his way up. The cupbearer and the chief baker make Pharaoh angry, and they get thrown in jail as well. So what did they do? All we know is that they offended the Pharaoh. And the word that's used for offended, well, in my translation, NRSV, it says that they offended, but it's actually the same Hebrew word that's used for sin. They sinned. They did something that was just wrong. And that's why they're in prison. What did they do? Doesn't matter. The point is, they did something wrong and they deserve to be in prison. And this helps to contrast how Joseph, who didn't deserve to be in prison, is also in the same place as them. Oftentimes, we have this tendency of looking at our situation and then we think that we can determine the cause of the situation. And this is showed up a lot in our predestination talk, right? But it also shows up in very practical ways. Oh, you didn't get that job because you must not have been praying enough. Oh, this sort of thing happened to you because you deserved it. It's not always so easy for us to pinpoint and to say why things are happening. People could have just assumed that Joseph was a person who did something terrible, and that's why he deserved to be there. Job's friends felt the exact same way about him. He must have some secret sin happening. Looking at our current situation, when we go through, especially when we go through difficult times, we ought to be careful about the conclusions that we jump to. Sometimes, at least in the case of Joseph, we see that sometimes God is using these difficult times as an opportunity for us. Well, what possibly is the opportunity that's being presented here? Well, the opportunity being presented here to Joseph is a chance to use that gift that he has. It is a very special gift, the ability to interpret dreams. It's not something that many people had. We don't hear of anyone else in the Old Testament, in the earlier parts of Genesis that we've read so far with this ability. Daniel is another notable character who does have this ability to interpret dreams. There was a whole crew of people who were professional dream interpreters within the world of Egypt. And these individuals were, at the request of the Pharaoh, they would be able to interpret whatever dreams you give to them. But here we have a situation where this cupbearer and this baker have a dream and they don't have access to the royal dream interpreters. And so it's as if they're left without any hope of knowing what this dream means. By the way, the dream that they have isn't the same as the kind of dreams that you and I may have, that are just random ideas floating around in our heads. It's very significant that these dreams are pointed out to us as a way in which the ancient world understood God speaking to them. This is a way of understanding what's to come by way of this medium of dreams. And so many ancient people took this sort of thing very seriously. And so finding the interpretation of the dream would have been a very important thing for them to do, but they don't have anyone. Joseph, being in this situation, has every reason to avoid such characters because it's his dreams that got him here in the first place. He could have avoided the hassle and further pain that this might cause to him. But yet we see, I think, the first important lesson from Joseph's life. In verse 6, it says that he saw that they were troubled. He could tell that there was something wrong. When we go through times of difficulty, there is a natural inclination for us to be very inward looking. We care, we feel as if the world is closing in on us. We need to take care of ourselves, and we don't have time to think about other people and their problems. And people who go through times of distress and discomfort and misery often aren't the pleasant people that you want to be around. You don't go and share your troubles with someone who's already troubled, because you know that they don't have the bandwidth for it. But Joseph seems to be at a place, even while in prison, of being able to help other people, of being able to recognize that there is a need for help. He was able to look upon other people and notice that there is a suffering there. And this is a different approach to the misery that he had. This almost sounds like a Jesus-style ministry, that in the midst of his discomfort, in the midst of his tiredness, in the midst of all the people coming to him and just wanting stuff from him and him being misunderstood and eventually him going to the cross, he would still look for those who were suffering and those who were in despair, because he always had something to give them. And I think this is the counterintuitive reality. When we go through times of difficulty, as real as that difficulty is, if we can take our eyes off of ourselves and learn to help others, it would give us a new perspective on the situation that we face. And it gives hope to those around us. In one sense, why is it so important for a Christian to maintain hope in the dark place? Well, because it's exactly in that dark place that people need light to be shined. And if we Christians, when we get into that dark place, don't shine that light, what hope is there for those around us, for those who don't believe? See, people look at Joseph when he's at his low point, and they saw that he was a man with dignity, with grace, and that's why he ended up being elevated. When people look at us in our low points, will they be able to find a similar kind of graciousness that draws them in? Will they be able to understand that we care about them? The act of interpreting a dream, it's not something that is a monopoly held by these Egyptian dream interpreters. God is the one who interprets the dreams. But God interprets the dreams through Joseph. And so in a way, for God to interpret the dreams of this baker and of this cupbearer, he needed for Joseph to be there in that place so that he could interpret the dream through his servant. We are where we are because this is where God has called us to be. It doesn't mean that we enjoy where we are. None of us like to be in the pandemic, for example, but God has placed us here. Rather than cribbing or complaining or finding some rationale for why someone's sin somewhere has caused us to be where we are today, we ought to be like Joseph, striving to do our best, striving to help others in the midst of it, finding something to do during this time. This is how we witness and testify to the hope that God has and that God gives to each one of us. Now let's look at the dreams. The cupbearer's dream. A vine with 3 branches, blossoms quickly, fruits quickly. He's able to take it. There's no time for fermentation here. He takes the grape, squeezes it into the Pharaoh's cup. Great. It doesn't seem immediately obvious to, I think, any of us, because I don't think any of us have the knack that Joseph has, but Joseph hears it, and it doesn't seem like he, at least the Bible doesn't say that he goes into a trance or prays or seeks God. It's quite instinctual for him. It comes quite naturally to him. He says, oh yeah, those 3 branches, that means 3 days. In 3 days, you will have your head lifted up. You will be restored. Having said that, he sneaks in this thing of, remember me. Remember me when you get to that point. I love the small and sometimes not so subtle nuances of the Old Testament narrative style. In 3 days, the cupbearer will be restored to his place beside the king. Does that sound familiar to anyone? I hope it does. That's the story of the resurrection in a way. Jesus is the cupbearer. He prayed, "Take this cup away from me," but in the end, he drank from that cup. He drank from it. And you know what a cupbearer does? A cupbearer in those days is the one who would taste the cup. If there's any poison, he would get it, not the king. Jesus took it on our behalf so that we wouldn't be poisoned. Okay, anyways, we're not going to get into all of those nuances. We already talked about some of those last week. The cupbearer gets to a point of being blessed, but then turns around and he forgets the source of the blessings. And it takes another 2 years before he is remembered. The baker in verse 16 hears this dream and thinks, his dream sounds similar to mine. He got a good interpretation. What you got for me, Joseph? And so he's very excited to listen to what Joseph says. And Joseph hears the dream and says, oh yeah, 3 baskets, that's 3 days. But the birds are going to eat from the basket. That means Pharaoh's going to lift your head. And I love how it's formatted, even in my Bible, dash from you. And it's like there's a build up and a suspense before he reels him in and tells him the grim truth that he's going to be hung. We aren't told the reaction of either of these servants. Nor are we told at the end of the chapter why one was redeemed and the other was hung. Like, we don't know anything about the backstory of this. That's because none of that stuff matters. The point that the writer is trying to get us to notice is Joseph and the nature of his willingness to be faithful to God even in trying times. Joseph, who is willing to bless others, even though he knows that he may not get to experience any of that joy. And in fact, he didn't for 2 more years. He didn't benefit one bit from the good action that he did in interpreting their dreams. See, sometimes the good that we do won't have the immediate results that we would expect. What do we do in that situation? Joseph's situation tells us that it doesn't matter if you get rewarded immediately or not. You do the right thing. You do what's right by God. And that whole phrase, doing what's right by God, that's the literal definition of being righteous. When we say be righteous, we're not saying be some pompous, holier than thou type of character. We're talking about doing the right thing that God has called us to do. And sometimes those right things are these very simple actions. I know that when we're going through times of difficulty, the last thing we want to do or want to be burdened with is someone else's difficulties. But when we do what Joseph did, then we're on our way to fulfilling that dream that he originally had. From sharing the dream, from receiving the dream of God about the sheaves and the 12 sheaves bowing down to the 1 sheaves, or the sun and moon and all the stars bowing down to Joseph, from those 2 dreams being shared by Joseph to his family, he was rewarded with slavery. For maintaining fidelity to God and to Potiphar by not accepting the advances of Potiphar's wife, Joseph was imprisoned. For helping 2 people by just doing the right thing, all that he got was to be forgotten for the next 2 years. But you know what? Even though he was forgotten by those 2, even though he was imprisoned by people, even though he was put into slavery, you know who was there with him the entire time? Well, it's not a real question for any of us, is it? In Genesis chapter 39, verse 21, that's the reason why we started from the end of chapter 39. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. Anytime you see the word steadfast love in your Bible, in the Old Testament at least, it's a translation of the Hebrew word chesed. It means a covenantal love. This is a love that will never fail. He has committed. It's the same kind of love that ought to be expressed between a husband and a wife. An undying, unshakable, I don't care if you're rude to me, I don't care what you do to me, I will commit myself to you. It's the same kind of steadfast love that was shown to Gomer by Hosea when Gomer was even unfaithful. This is the kind of God who is with Joseph and who is with each one of us when we go through times of difficulty. Why is this chapter here? Because in some ways we could have skipped this chapter. Right? We could have just had two rises and falls of Joseph. Why do we need this third one? Well, I think it just goes to show us how we ought to persevere, especially in trying times. When we fall, and we will fall, and when we are hit by the storm, and when we're hit by sadness or depression, or when we're overwhelmed with stress, or when we feel as though we've been betrayed, don't lose hope. It doesn't matter what the situation looks like. It doesn't matter if someone who deserves to be in our shoes experiencing what we're experiencing is next to us. It doesn't mean that we ought to also then forget God and just accept our fate. No, sometimes we have to understand that God uses these situations as an opportunity for us, an opportunity to show hope that is unending, a hope that Christ gives to us. And this isn't the same kind of hope that we mean when we use it in the cheap way that we usually use it nowadays, which is, well, I hope I do well on that exam, or I hope it doesn't rain tomorrow. That's a kind of hope that's just wishful thinking that would like something to happen. Christian, biblical hope is a confidence in what is unseen. It is the ability to foretaste that meal that we've still not yet received. And what is that foretaste of the promises of God? Or what is that thing that gives us the hope that we have? Well, it's the foretaste of those dreams that God has given to us. What dreams are you talking about? Well, there might be personal dreams that I actually don't know that you do know. But then I'm also talking about the dreams like the Bible for us, Revelation, the entire book of it, the story of how no one could have possibly thought of these things, and yet it comes to fruition. Those dreams we have experienced. The historical nature of Christ is real. What about the foretaste of being clothed by a loving father? Quite like how Joseph was clothed by his father. And it's a new clothes, and it's something different. It's something that's unlike what the rest of the world possesses. Maybe we want to call it, in theological terms, a new heart. Maybe we want to call it just putting off the old self and putting on the new self. That foretaste of recognizing a change that is within us, that is not of us, that is a foretaste of what God is doing in us, and that he will bring this to its culmination. What about the foretaste of all of the past grace that we've received? The time that we were in an accident, but it wasn't nearly as bad as it could have been. The time when the diagnosis came and we were just hit, but then God healed us through it. The time when we feel like this relationship isn't going to get better, but then it does. All of those past real experiences are just a foretaste of what's to come. And that's what gives us hope in these dark times. Another reason, though, why this chapter is here is because within the narrative framework of Genesis, this chapter sets us up for chapter 41, where the Pharaoh will eventually have a dream, and he'll eventually need an interpreter. And that cupbearer will remember Joseph. And so finally, it's getting linked together. How do we bring Joseph into this story? Well, this is how, because of this dark moment in his life. I wonder, what does this moment mean for us? Because 2 years from now, or whatever the time period may be, God will have hoped to prepare us for that moment. There might be something that we're going through now that we don't enjoy particularly, but God is enabling us to go through it because a long time from now, at some point, he's going to use those experiences and he's going to use us to do something part of his plan. I've heard that, and this is a testimony that can only be given by someone who's gone through it. I know an auntie in the Horeb Marthama Church who went through cancer, and she would be able to say that I went through cancer so that I can convince other people who are going through cancer that they can have hope. The ability to be able to see that my current situation, it's not just about me. That's a very self-centered way of looking at it. We are characters in God's story, and he is building up this grand storyline. What does this time mean for you and for me? The Apostle Paul and Silas, they were imprisoned. A very kind of similar situation. They had the opportunity to escape, but they don't, because they saw that there was a need. There was a jailer who was about to take his own life. They got an opportunity to witness, to testify. Why were they in that jail in the first place? They didn't deserve to be in that jail, but God put them there. God put them there so that they would be able to be used for a specific purpose. Who knows how the rest of that story ends? All the different people that jailer would be able to tell the story to. I mean, it just goes and goes. And this is the whole kingdom of God story, right? A little bit of leaven will expand. When we recall Jesus at his lowest point, and I had mentioned this earlier, Jesus thought of others too. And he shows us the pure love of God, whether it be in John's gospel, it's a little different, right? We don't have the prayer of Gethsemane short version. We kind of have a long version of that prayer that Jesus does in John chapter 17. And in that prayer, his mind is on his disciples and on those who would believe in their testimony. And he's praying for them, even though he's about to go to the cross. What about the fact when he's on the cross and he's saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do? What about the instructions that Jesus has for his mother and for John of how they ought to be a family, how they ought to take care of one another now that he's going to be gone? The fact that he is on the cross in agony and all he could think of is comforting his mother, comforting John. That kind of hope needs to be seen by the world. That's why God puts us in the situations that he puts us in. So take heart, no matter what you're in. We are called to be like Joseph. We are called to show that God is sovereign in and through our obedience to him. And even though it might not look like things are working out, oh, it will. So may the good Lord strengthen us to believe in that promise.